Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're diving into something really interesting, actually, that you sent us. An
Oh,
article called, What Would a Narcissistic Society Look Like?
okay.
From the Narcissistic Abuse Network.
Interesting.
And it's all about how narcissistic traits, not just individual narcissists,
Right.
but how these traits could affect society as a whole.
Yeah.
And it really got me thinking, could we already be seeing some of these dynamics play out around us?
Mm.
What do you think?
Well, I mean, the article makes a really crucial point right off the bat, I think.
Kinda.
It's not about, diagnosing everyone with,
Right.
clinical narcissistic personality disorder.
Oh, yeah?
It's more about recognizing these narcissistic tendencies that we all possess to some degree
Right.
and how those can kind of get amplified in a culture.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, it's like we all have that mini narcissist lurking
Wow.
inside, especially when we're younger,
Yeah.
wanting things our way,
For sure.
demanding attention.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, as kids, it's about survival, right?
Oh, totally.
We need attention. We need resources.
Yeah.
We need to assert ourselves
Right.
to get our needs met.
Totally.
But as we mature, ideally,
Yeah.
those narcissistic tendencies are kind of tempered by
Right.
empathy,
Yeah.
and the ability to consider others' needs.
Right.
So,
So it's about finding that balance, right? Not letting the me mentality take over.
yeah, absolutely. And the article argues that when those tendencies become dominant
Okay.
in a culture, you start to see some pretty distinct patterns.
Interesting. Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit.
Yeah.
The article outlines several traits
Okay.
of a narcissistic culture. And the first one that jumped out to me was this intense self-focus. And individualism, it's like
Yeah.
everyone's constantly pushing their own agenda,
Right.
and it creates this really competitive...
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like that saying, it's all about me.
Right.
And this leads to people just prioritizing their own personal gain,
Yeah.
often at the expense of others.
Oh, wow.
It's a very transactional view of the world
Right.
where relationships are seen as means to an end
Yeah.
rather than genuine connections.
So it's not just about being selfish.
Right.
It's deeper than that. It affects how we see
Exactly.
the world and the people around us.
Yeah, it creates this kind of distorted lens
Oh, wow.
where everyone is either a potential asset or an obstacle to
Right.
achieving our goals.
That's a good point. And that kind of ties into the next trait.
Okay.
The article highlights the obsession with possessions, wealth, and status.
Yeah, for sure.
In a narcissistic culture, it's not just about having nice things. It's about what those things say about you.
Exactly.
But look at me. I'm successful.
Yes.
I'm important. I'm better than you.
Exactly, yeah. It's this constant need to prove your worth through these external markers
Yeah.
of success.
Wow.
And this just fuels this culture of comparison and one-upmanship,
Yeah,
where people are constantly trying to outdo each other.
totally. And it makes me think about social media.
Oh, yeah.
It's like a breeding ground
It is.
for this kind of narcissistic display.
Yeah.
Everyone's curating their perfect online persona, showcasing their possessions, their vacations.
Yeah. And it creates this illusion of perfection
Totally.
that's impossible to maintain
Right.
in real life.
Yeah, it's all about projecting an image
Yeah.
rather than cultivating
Yeah.
genuine connection.
Totally.
So we have this self-focus, this materialism, this constant comparison. It sounds exhausting.
It is.
It makes me wonder, what happens to empathy
Right.
in a culture like this?
That's the crucial question. And the article argues that empathy really takes a back seat in a narcissistic culture. Because why bother understanding someone else's perspective when you're so focused
Yeah.
on your own needs and goals, right?
It's like everyone's wearing blinders, only focused on their own
Yeah.
narrow lane.
Yeah.
And that ties into the next trait the article mentions,
Okay.
this competition over cooperation.
Yeah, exactly. In a narcissistic society, cooperation is seen as a weakness.
Wow.
It's all about winning,
Right.
even if it means sabotaging others along the way.
Right.
And this leads to a breakdown of trust.
Oh, wow.
Makes it incredibly difficult to solve collective problems.
It's like everyone's playing a zero-sum game
Yes.
where one person's gain is always another person's loss.
Right. And this competitive mindset can be incredibly destructive,
Yeah.
not just for individuals,
Right.
but for society as a whole.
Wow.
Undermines our ability to work together towards shared goals.
Yeah.
And creates this climate of fear and distrust.
So we've got this self-focus, this materialism, this competition. It's starting to paint a pretty bleak picture, honestly.
It is, yeah.
And then the article goes even further
Oh.
and introduces this idea of craving for significance.
Right. And this is a key element, I
Yeah.
think, in understanding,
Yeah.
the dynamics of a narcissistic culture.
Mhm.
This craving for significance is more than just wanting to be like, ooh, recognized.
Okay.
It's this desperate need
Oh.
for attention and validation
Okay.
to kind of prop up this
Yeah.
fragile sense of self.
So it's not just about being selfish. It's
Right.
a deeper, almost like psychological
It is.
need.
Yeah. Yeah. Imagine like a deep well of insecurity
Oh, wow.
that constantly needs refilling
Okay.
with external validation.
Right.
And that leads us to a term that the article uses quite a bit,
Okay.
which is narcissistic supply.
Okay, I've heard that term before,
Yeah.
but to be honest, I'm not totally clear on what it means.
Okay, sure.
Could you break it down for me?
Yeah, so think of narcissistic supply as the fuel of
Think
that.
keeps a narcissist's ego inflated.
Okay.
Can come from attention,
Yeah.
admiration, power,
Mhm.
or even like fear and control over others.
Right.
It's basically anything that makes them feel important,
Okay.
special, or superior.
So it's not just about getting what they want
Right.
materially. It's
Right.
about feeding this inner
Yeah.
need for validation.
Exactly. Exactly. It's about filling an inner void with that external affirmation
Mhm.
because they lack a stable sense of self-worth,
Right.
independent of these sources.
Wow. And how does this supply, this need for supply, tie into all the traits we've been talking about? The self-focus, the materialism,
Yeah.
the competition.
Well, each of these traits can be seen as a way of securing that narcissistic supply.
Okay.
The self-focus is about drawing attention to oneself.
Okay.
The materialism is about showcasing status
Mhm.
and eliciting admiration.
Right.
The competition
Mhm.
is about proving superiority.
Gaining a sense of power and control.
So it's all connected.
Yeah.
These traits aren't just like isolated behaviors.
No, they're all part of a system
Right.
designed to feed this need
Wow.
for validation.
And when those traits become pervasive in a culture,
Mm-hmm.
it creates this like feedback loop where
Yeah.
everyone is vying for
Yeah.
attention, validation, a sense of superiority.
That's right.
And that can lead to some pretty dysfunctional dynamics.
And it can.
Right, because if everyone's focused on getting their own supply,
Right.
who's left to actually care about the well-being?
Exactly. That's the danger.
Right.
A narcissistic culture can become incredibly isolating
Yeah.
and dehumanizing
Right.
because it reduces interactions to transactions.
Mhm.
What can I get from this person?
Wow.
How can I use them to my advantage?
It sounds like a recipe for disaster, honestly.
It can be, yeah.
But the article also talks about something called deception and manipulation as a hallmark
Mm-hmm.
of a narcissistic culture.
Yeah.
How does that fit into all of this?
Well, think about it. If your primary goal is to secure narcissistic supply,
Okay.
attention, validation, power,
Right.
then honesty and integrity might get in the way.
Right, because the truth might not always be flattering
Exactly.
or convenient.
Right.
It might not get you the attention
Right.
or the admiration that you crave.
Exactly. So in a narcissistic culture, we see this blurring of the lines
Mhm.
between truth and fabrication.
Right.
Lies become tools
Yeah.
for manipulating perceptions,
Okay.
controlling narratives, maintaining this carefully crafted image.
It's like that whole post-truth idea
Yeah,
where facts become less important
exactly.
than individual narratives,
Yeah,
even if those narratives are based on lies
right.
or distortions.
It's a dangerous trend,
It is.
and one that's deeply connected to this craving for significance.
Right.
Because if you can control the narrative,
Mm-hmm.
you can control how people see you. Right.
And avoid accountability for your actions.
So it's about protecting your ego,
Sadly, yes.
even if it means sacrificing truth and integrity.
That's right.
And that can have devastating consequences, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole.
It can.
Because when truth becomes subjective and malleable,
Yeah.
it erodes trust,
Mm-hmm.
makes it really hard to solve problems
It does.
collectively.
It really does.
It's a scary thought. And it makes me wonder, how do relationships even work
Right.
in a culture like this? If everyone's focused on themselves, manipulating each other to get what they want, can there be any genuine connection?
That's a great question. And it leads us to the next trait the article explores,
Okay.
which is shallow relationships.
Right.
In a narcissistic society,
Yeah.
genuine connection becomes nearly impossible.
Because vulnerability is seen as a weakness, right?
Exactly.
It's all about maintaining that perfect facade, hiding your flaws
Yeah.
and insecurities. In a culture that prizes image over substance, right, people become incredibly guarded
Yeah.
and afraid to show their true selves. It's like everyone's wearing a mask.
Right.
And no one knows what's real anymore.
So you have all of this, like surface level interaction, but no real depth or intimacy.
It must feel incredibly lonely.
It must, yeah. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We talked about self-focus, materialism, competition, this craving for significance, deception, shallow relationships. It's a lot to process.
It is.
And frankly, it's a bit depressing.
Yeah, it's definitely not a rosy picture.
But before we completely succumb to societal despair, the article does offer some real-world examples of how these dynamics can play out on a larger scale.
That's right.
And then it starts to shift towards potential solutions.
Yes, it does.
Okay, I'm ready for a little glimmer of hope here.
Okay.
Because if we're heading towards this full-blown narcissistic society, I need to know there's a way to course correct.
Okay, let's dive into those examples.
Okay.
And then explore some of those antidotes.
I'm all ears.
Okay.
Because this deep dive has been really eye-opening.
Good.
And I'm starting to see these traits pop up in places I never would have noticed before.
Interesting.
So you mentioned like real-world examples of how these narcissistic traits can play out on a larger scale.
Yeah, it pointed to some pretty high-profile examples, actually, of corporate collapses.
Right.
And attributed them, at least in part, to narcissistic leadership.
Interesting.
You know, cases like N.A.N, WeWork, Theranos, these kinds of things.
Whoa, those are some big names.
Yeah.
How do you connect corporate failure to something like narcissism?
Well, I mean, think about the traits we've been discussing.
Okay.
These companies. You know, while appearing wildly successful initially, we're often led by these like charismatic figures who prioritized personal gain and image over the kind of long-term well-being of the company and its employees.
So it's that outward success masking a deeper rot.
Exactly.
Like how a narcissist might project this charming persona.
Yeah, totally.
But lack, genuine empathy or concern for others.
Exactly.
It's the same pattern.
It is.
Just playing out on a much larger scale.
Exactly.
And the consequences can be devastating.
It can be.
Not just for the individual, but for like entire industries, even the economy as a whole.
Totally. It's almost like a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
A reminder that even in the business world, unchecked narcissism can lead to disastrous results.
Okay, so it's not just limited to the corporate world.
No.
The article also touched on how these dynamics can play out in social and political movements.
Right, and this is where things get a little bit tricky.
Right, because we see a lot of accusations of narcissism being thrown around these days.
All the time.
Especially in the political sphere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the article raises a really important point here.
Okay.
You know, it's crucial to distinguish between like legitimate critiques of harmful behavior and just like labeling anyone who disagrees with us as a narcissist.
Right, because that kind of shuts down any possibility of meaningful dialogue.
Exactly.
Like, if you don't agree with me, you're automatically the problem.
Exactly, and that kind of black and white thinking, that inability to see nuance or consider alternative perspectives is kind of a hallmark of narcissistic thinking.
Wow, that's kind of mind-blowing.
It is, right.
So how do we navigate these conversations?
Yeah, that's a good question.
In a way that's productive and avoids falling into those same narcissistic traps.
Well, the article suggests, I think, that a key part of the solution is really developing our capacity for critical thinking.
So not just accepting everything we hear at face value.
Yeah.
But actually questioning information.
Right.
Looking for evidence. Considering different perspectives.
Exactly. Precisely. It's about becoming, more discerning consumers of information, especially in this age of, social media information overload, we need to develop the skills to separate fact from fiction, to identify biases, to evaluate information critically.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Because if we're constantly bombarded with information, that's designed to manipulate us.
Yeah.
To appeal to our emotions rather than our reason. We can easily get swept up in these narratives that aren't actually true or beneficial.
And this is where that concept of narcissistic supply,
comes back into play.
Okay.
Because in a world where attention equals power, there's a huge incentive to create content that's outrageous, inflammatory, or designed to trigger those strong emotional reactions.
So it's not just about spreading information. It's about, capturing attention.
Totally.
Getting those clicks, those likes, those shares.
It is. And in that environment, truth often takes a backseat to sensationalism.
Which makes it all the more important for us.
It does.
To cultivate those critical thinking skills.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we need to be more mindful of the information we consume, the sources we trust, the narratives we're buying into.
Absolutely, yeah. And we need to be willing to challenge our own biases and assumptions.
Because none of us are immune.
None of us are.
To manipulation. Especially when it's coming from sources that align.
Yeah, exactly. With our existing beliefs or worldview.
This
is a lot to take in.
It is.
But it's really making me think about my own online behavior and how I engage with information.
Yeah, it's a lifelong process. And one that requires constant vigilance and self-reflection.
Totally. But it's crucial, not just for our individual well-being, but for the health of our society as a whole.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about these alarming trends, these real-world examples of how narcissistic tendencies can play out, the importance of critical thinking. But the article also points to the cyclical nature of this throughout history,
It does, the rise and fall of empires, the patterns of corruption and decline, the dangers of kind of unchecked power. These themes have been recurring throughout human history. And often at the heart of these societal collapses, we see the influence of, narcissistic leaders and a culture that enables and rewards those traits.
That's a pretty sobering thought.
It is.
I mean, are we doomed to repeat?
It's a good question.
These patterns? Is a narcissistic society inevitable?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, the article offers some potential antidotes, some ways to counteract these negative influences. And it starts with a shift in focus, I think. Instead of trying to, fix narcissists or change the world around us, it emphasizes the importance of individual responsibility.
So focusing on what we can control.
Exactly.
Our own thoughts, behaviors, choices.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those narcissistic tendencies within ourselves and making conscious choices to act differently.
Okay, that sounds empowering. But how do we actually do that?
That's a good question.
How do we break free from these patterns that seem so deeply ingrained in our culture?
The article suggests several strategies. One of the most powerful, I think, is consciously cultivating empathy.
Empathy. We've talked about it a lot today.
We have.
But it's worth, emphasizing. It's kind of like the superpower we all have.
It is.
But maybe forget to use sometimes.
We do. It really is. And in a culture that's becoming increasingly narcissistic, I think empathy is like the antidote, the counterbalance.
Yeah, totally.
It's the ability to step outside of our own self-centered bubble and really understand the perspectives and experiences of others.
So it's not just about feeling sorry for someone. It's about actually trying to see the world through their eyes.
Exactly.
Understand their feelings, even if we don't agree with them.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that shared humanity that connects us all, even when we have those differences of opinion or come from different backgrounds.
And how do we actually cultivate empathy? Is it something we're just born with? Or can we actually develop it?
Well, the good news is empathy is a skill that we can practice and strengthen.
Okay, good.
It's about making that conscious effort to listen to others, to validate their feelings, to ask questions, to try to understand their perspective.
So it's like a muscle. We can work out. The more we use it, the stronger it becomes.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
Okay, cool.
And just like any muscle, it needs regular exercise.
Right.
So, look for those opportunities to engage in meaningful conversations with people who are different from you. Read books and watch movies that expose you to different perspectives. Volunteer your time to causes that align with your values.
Okay, that all makes sense. But what about, those times when we encounter people who are behaving in really narcissistic ways? How do we
That's a good question.
deal with that without getting sucked in to their drama?
That's where I think setting boundaries comes in.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that we can't control other people's behavior, but we can control how we respond to it.
Right.
We can choose to disengage from those toxic interactions to protect our own emotional well-being and to focus our energy on relationships that are mutually supportive and enriching.
So it's not about becoming a doormat or letting people walk all over us.
No, not at all.
It's about protecting our own energy, sanity.
Exactly. And it's also about recognizing that, we can't change other people.
Right.
We can't force them to be more empathetic or less narcissistic.
Right.
But we can choose how we interact with them. We can choose to surround ourselves with people who do value those things.
Right. This is all starting to click together. Yeah. We've talked about these big, societal trends, these individual traits.
Yeah.
But it really boils down to personal choices, doesn't it?
It really does. And that's where I think the real power lies.
Yeah.
We might not be able to single-handedly shift the entire culture, but we can choose to live our lives in a way that reflects the values that we want to see in the world.
So it's about being the change we want to see.
Yeah.
Cheesy as that sounds.
Well, it's a bit cliche, I know, but it's true.
Yeah.
Because our individual choices, I think, have a ripple effect.
They do.
When we choose empathy over judgment, cooperation over competition, authenticity over image management, we're sending a message to the world.
Yeah.
And we're creating a space for others to do the same.
That kind of brings us back to the original question.
Yeah.
What would a narcissistic society look like?
Right.
Well, we've explored some of the, potential downsides, the dangers of unchecked narcissism.
Yeah.
But we've also talked about, the antidotes, the ways to counteract those influences and create a more, humane and sustainable society.
And it starts with each of us, I think.
Yeah.
Taking responsibility for our own thoughts, behaviors, and choices.
So, dear listener, we're leaving you with this challenge.
Okay.
How can you cultivate more empathy in your own life?
Right.
How can you challenge those narcissistic tendencies within yourself?
Good question.
How can you contribute to creating a world that values connection, authenticity, and the well-being of all?
It's a journey, not a destination. It starts with one small step at a time.
Well said. That's a wrap for this deep dive.
Great.
Thanks for listening, and keep those questions coming.